Okay, moving right along here in Lessing's Education of the Human Race, which I want to discuss now. But first, his treatise Laocoon, and here it is, the limits, Laocoon, or the Limits of Poetry and Painting, and this was published in 1767 as a reaction to the publication of Winckelmann's History of the Art of Antiquity, which was published a few years earlier in 1764, in which Winckelmann characterizes the Greeks with his famous phrase, noble simplicity and calm grandeur. That's the world of Greek art and sculpture, which of course is only, as Nietzsche realized in 1872 when he wrote The Birth of Tragedy, that's only the Apollonian aspect of the Greeks. Where's the Dionysian aspect, which isn't so calm, and which is fully described in a play like Euripides' play, The Bacchae. So Nietzsche will bring the Dionysian later on to supplement Winckelmann's somewhat shallow take on the Greeks. And he discusses this three-stage theory of the evolution of Greek art that moves from a stage of necessity all the way down to Phidias in the 5th century, then to Periclean Athens with the explosion of all the great artists there, Praxiteles, and all the way down to Lysippus, all the great sculptors, of which Steiner has said that Goethe was one of them in a past life, which I find to be quite interesting. And that's the stage of the apotheosis of beauty. And then finally with the dawning of the Hellenistic age, with Alexander the Great and his empire, which then falls apart into the three separate kingdoms of the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the Antigonids, we get the decline of art into superfluity, according to Winckelmann. So that's where we're at. So Lessing then publishes this very interesting treatise, and I think it's one of my favorite works on aesthetics, actually, on the limits of poetry and painting. And here's an image of the Laocoon sculpture that dates from the Hellenistic period, about, as far as we know, about 100 BC or so. And it depicts Laocoon, the character of Laocoon here, with his two sons being stung by a serpent that has been sent to punish them by Apollo, because Laocoon was on the side of the Trojans in the Trojan War. And this is what Virgil discusses in his Aeneid, which dates from somewhere around 19 BC or so, and describes it. And the episode is that he is warning, he's a sort of priest of Apollo who's warning the Trojans not to accept the Trojan horse. So that's the warning, and he throws his spear at it, and then Apollo sends at him then these serpents that sting him and his two sons to death. Now, so Lessing begins with the question of why it is that in this sculpture, which was unearthed in the time of the Renaissance, it wasn't available until then, and it inspired a lot of the sculpture of Michelangelo. It was very greatly admired, and it is indeed, though it is Hellenistic, a great work of art, nonetheless. So the question then becomes, why is Laocoon depicted here looking mildly uncomfortable, when in the Aeneid, Virgil describes him as screaming his head off in terror and agony? It looks like he's, in the sculpture, it looks more like he's kind of striking a pose, for a fashion photographer or something. It doesn't look like he's screaming his head off. And so it had been thought up to this time that the arts of sculpture and painting and literature basically can all accomplish the same thing, more or less, in their respective media. But Lessing is the one who comes along and says, no, there are things that you can do with poetry that you cannot do with painting and sculpture. And the reason that Laocoon has been depicted in this sculpture as only mildly uncomfortable is because beauty is the aim of sculpture, not ugliness. And so you can't have, the way Virgil describes it with him screaming his head off, you can't do that in sculpture because it would be grotesque. At least these are the standards of the aesthetic standards of the Enlightenment, of course. We know that's not the case anymore, especially not with contemporary art, with artists like Damien Hirst. You can depict anything you want in sculpture. But Lessing's point then, he makes a further point, which I think is a better and more interesting point, which is namely that with regard to poetry, it's different from painting sculpture and architecture, in that painting, sculpture, and architecture are arts of space, whereas poetry flows through time. It's an art that unfolds through time. So you can describe anything you want, and you can describe it part by part as it evolves and unfolds through time, whereas with poetry and with painting and sculpture, you have to capture and distill the moment, the poignant moment from which everything else must be inferred. And so he sees poetry as a superior art, actually, to painting, sculpture, and architecture. You can do a lot more with it since it unfolds through time and it's descriptive. Very interesting treatise, and I highly recommend it. It was very influential on Goethe, on his aesthetic theory, as well as on Schopenhauer. And speaking of Goethe, let's take a look then at his paper here briefly, The Stages of Man's Mind. This was published in 1817, so it's very late, and it's just a sketch. But now we have seen that both Winkelmann and Lessing have these tripartite divisions of history. And Vico, at about the same time, was also writing his version of history as a four-stage model, which he has picked up from Hesiod's four stages. And Goethe does it as well as a four-stage model here in this little essay that was very influential on Oswald Spengler, who inherits the four stages model of history rather than a three-stage, because the four-stage model comes from the Greeks and it comes from Hesiod. And the Hindus also have it with their four different yugas. And so at the bottom here, Goethe summarizes the paper when he's talking about cultures and their cycles, basic origins, considered in depth and appropriately defined as follows. And to the left here, we see the first phase is poetic. You get the epic poetry of the Eddas at the beginning of Faustian civilization, let's say, or the epic poetry of Homer. In Egypt, this would be the pyramid texts, actually, which are the oldest religious texts in the world, 2600 BC, and the Rig Veda in India. So this is the poetic period, which is robust and full of imagination. And then we have a theological period where the theology begins to form, as it does with St. Thomas Aquinas, and in the 12th and 13th centuries, we start getting theology, which is sort of fusion of religion on the one hand and revelation with philosophy. So there's a theological phase, and he says this is characterized by a rising to the ideal and the sacred, and reason begins to come in and displace pure imagination. So we move from the period of the epics, what Toynbee calls the heroic age, to the age of bringing the mind in now and thinking, but without exterminating the sacred. The sacred is still there, piety is still there, religion is not questioned, God is not questioned. And so then it moves to the philosophical period now. So this is the metaphysical period. This is the age in which Goethe himself was living. This is the age of the Enlightenment. It says we have intellectual doubting now coming in, and this is sensible, and the intellect now comes in, and this is the distinction in German between Vernunft and Verstand. Verstand is the intellect, the understanding, and it has to do with applying causality through space and time to understanding the way things work, how the parts fit together of things. It's a mechanical way of understanding the world, whereas reason, Vernunft, has to do with the apprehension of the grand metaphysical ideas, God, freedom, the soul, immortality, all of those kinds of things. So it gets displaced to Enlightenment intellect. And Goethe was able to balance all three of these, imagination, reason, and intellect. Being the titan that he was able to balance them quite well. And then finally we get a dissolution into a merely prosaic period. This would correspond to Winkelmann's superfluous period of art and to Spengler's civilization phase that displaces the Kultur phase, which is three stages: the pre-cultural period, the early cultural period, the late cultural period, and then finally the disintegration into the civilization period, where all the empires are built. The universal states come into being. In Islam, we get the Ottoman Empire. The classical civilization, we get the Roman Empire. And we're in the process right now, according to Spengler, of doing that very thing. and our dissolution into the ordinary here, as Goethe characterizes this epoch that he had not even, he lived to 1832, and so he had not even lived into it, which Spengler sees as beginning more or less in Paris in the 1860s, with the dawning of modernity and the beginnings of the rise of industrialization and the rise of city intellect. And that's when he marks the beginnings of the decline of the West. And it just dissolves into the common, into mere sensuality. That which appeals to the senses is the thing that bread and circuses for the masses, all of that kind of thing. And so it dissolves into an intermingling, hostility, dissolution. So Goethe's little tiny model here becomes the basis for Spengler's four-stage model, which he combines with Goethe's essay on the metamorphosis of plants to envision civilizations undergoing transformations like plants do. So those are the two pieces that fundamentally, in addition to the birth of tragedy with this, Nietzsche's idea of the Socratic man there that we talked about last time, which Spengler himself sees Lessing as an example of, is exemplified. All right, so let's take a look then at Education of the Human Race. Now, this is a long essay that was published by Lessing in 1780. And it's made up of 100 aphorisms, and we're not going to read them, but it's good to just have them here to glance at. So he says in the first, so we're going to just do a quick flyby in this video of the first 52 aphorisms, because Christ does not appear on stage until aphorism number 53. So for the first 52 aphorisms, he's discussing the Hebrews as the childhood of humanity. And he sees them, it's interesting because in his play Nathan the Wise, which was written about a year before this, and it's his last play, and it's generally regarded as the first German play of ideas, in which he has the three Abrahamic religions with Nathan and the Knight Templar there and Saladin, all representing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as each of the three religions should tolerate each other. And so he regards them in a kind of spatial way in that play. Here they all are on the table before us, and none of them can claim to be the superior religion or to have the superior revelation. They're all worshiping the same God after all. And here it's a little bit different because it's through time now. It's a three-stage model, as we have seen with Joachim of Fiore, that he's borrowed from Joachim, and he'll make a vague reference to him at the end of the essay. A three-stage model where he transforms Joachim's model into a temporal model of the childhood of humanity. With the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have the maturity of humanity, and then with the age of the Holy Spirit, we will have, and Lessing makes reference in a kind of a vague way at the end of the essay to this third age of the Holy Spirit. He doesn't go into it. He spends half of the essay on the Hebrews and what was wrong with them, why they were childish and barbarous, which he regards them as. So it's very clear that he sees in this model, unlike the play, it's very clear that he sees the Hebrew revelation as inferior to the New Testament, because he regards the Hebrews as a childish people here. All right, so he starts out in the first aphorism by saying what education is to the individual human being, revelation is to the whole human race. So in aphorism 2, education is revelation imparted to the individual, and revelation is education which has been and still is imparted to the human race. So for him, education and revelation are the same thing. So this is the rather disappointing Enlightenment view of a reasonable religion. Revelation is reasonable, and it educates humanity. But on the one hand, he'll make a difference between revelation and reason, as we'll see here. And then he says, of the first man, he doesn't make reference to Adam, but obviously he says, even if the first human being was equipped with the concept of the one and only God, this concept being imparted and not independently acquired. So it's not the idea of God. He sides here with the rationalist, insofar as, like with Descartes, we get the idea that God is an innate idea. We are born equipped with it. It's not something that we've abstracted from experience. So even if Adam had God as an innate idea, as a single deity, he says as soon as human reason left to its own devices began to work on it, it divided the one immeasurable being into several more measurable parts. In other words, polytheism. So there's this prelude to the Hebrews, who are the childhood, but he does recognize a fourth religion in a certain sense, and he only refers to it here vaguely as pagan idolatry. And so that's because the human reason works on the idea of the monotheistic God, and it just automatically breaks it up because that's the nature of human reason. That's what it does. So he says, but as God can no longer reveal himself to each individual human being, now he chose an individual people for this special education, the chosen people, the people of Israel. And they are slaves, and therefore they must not have had or been allowed by the Egyptians to worship, since they weren't allowed to worship the Egyptian religion. So they invented their own, or God rather, revealed himself to them. And so they have this idea of monotheism. But they're childish and barbarous, he says, this uncouth people, which are led out of Egypt and settled in Canaan, where they keep regressing back to polytheism. That's the problem with polytheism. This regression. The first regression happens, of course, the moment Moses goes up Mount Sinai, and then he comes back down with the Ten Commandments that represents, on the one hand, the birth of the alphabet, which is an overturning of the hieroglyphs. And we have evidence of this now from turquoise mines in the Sinai, where there was a Hebrew proletariat there who were working as slaves for the Egyptians, as far as we can tell. And that's the earliest inscriptions of the alphabet that we get, inscribed on these rocks. And the letter A, as everyone knows, is simply the hieroglyph of a bull's head turned upside down. You turn an A upside down and you can see the bull's two horns, and that is exactly what it originally was. So they're overturning the hieroglyphs, which are pictographs connected with images and idolatry, and they are transforming them into abstract thinking and an abstract God. And so we get an invisible God, a dual pseudomorphosis, as Spengler would put it. And that's I think the reason why the Hebrews then invent an invisible God. We have to think of the two founders of the religion, Abraham on the one hand, who was a Sumerian. He came from the city-state of Ur, where the primary deity there was Nanesene, the moon god. And so he leaves that state and goes on various journeys, goes down into Egypt and so forth. So he becomes this sort of founder of the idea of monotheism. And then we have Moses, who comes out of Egypt and brings the Levites, the tribe of the Levites, which is related to the word, by the way, for serpent, as in Leviathan. And Moses, of course, we know at one point his staff turns into a serpent. So there's this constant danger of going back to polytheism. And when Moses brings down those tablets, the Jews here have already constructed a golden calf. So they've already reverted back to polytheism. This is probably a memory of the Apis bull in Egypt that was sacrificed on an annual basis. So, as Leonard Schlein puts it in The Alphabet versus the Goddess, here the first collision between purely abstract word with the alphabet and the image of the bull ends in shattering both of them, because they destroy the golden bull and they grind it up and make everyone take a communion meal out of it, which is interesting. And then Moses has to go back up and get a second edition of the Ten Commandments. And so there's this constant regression to polytheism. And the other thing that Lessing rejects or that Lessing objects to, is the fact, and why he thinks the Hebrews were childish and uncouth, is that the Hebrews don't have the idea of immortality of the soul. It's not there until later on. But initially, they don't have immortality of the soul or the idea of reward and retribution in a future life after death. As Franz Borkenau put it, with this second generation of civilization, after the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, we get, with the Greeks and with the Hebrews, not a death-transcending attitude as with the first generation, but a death-accepting attitude, and along with that, not much interest in the afterlife or the immortality of the soul. Sheol is what the Hebrews called the afterlife, and they just throw their dead in caves. As we see Abraham buying a cave for his tomb from the Hittites, they just throw their dead in caves and forget about them. That's it. So they don't have immortality of the soul or the idea of an afterlife, and he objects to this. But he says, so you give to the child a primer, but the primer, as the child grows, is going to be changed and transformed. And eventually what will happen is that we get the Babylonian captivity. And with the Babylonian captivity, about 586, after the Assyrians have destroyed the northern kingdom in 722, Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah is then deported into Babylon. The Babylonians copy the Assyrians. These are Neo-Babylonians, actually, at about 586 BC, and deport the Hebrews to to Mesopotamia, which is probably fortunate because, as Lessing says, there they discovered the idea of the immortality of the soul. And they got it from the Babylonians and also from the Persians, who, when the Persians then come in under Cyrus in about 550 BC or so, Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, rules from, I think, 550 to 529 BC. And he restores the Jews to their homeland. He takes them back to Judah. So now Lessing says, so they've got the idea of the immortality of the soul, and possibly the idea of an afterlife, a future world. And not only that, though, it wasn't just that they got those two ideas. It's that they were exposed to the mythologies and religions of the Babylonians, where they got plenty of myths, such as the flood myth, which comes from the Gilgamesh epic, and also it also has its own epic called the Atrahasis. And so they've got these ideas, and then also possibly the idea of Satan has come from Zoroastrianism. The Persians were Zoroastrian, and you have cosmic dualism, not monotheism. In this case, you have the god of light, who is Ahura Mazda, the good god, but then he is opposed to a god of darkness, Angramanyu, or Ahriman, as a god of darkness who corrupts everything that Ahura Mazda builds. And so Zoroastrianism has this cosmic one-shot arc of history as having a beginning, a middle, and an ending, and it's not a cycle that will ever repeat itself. And they're the first culture to have this idea that, like the Hindus and even the Greeks, still have the idea of history unfolding through a cycle of phases and stages, 4 stages usually that come round and then go round again. You get to the Kali Yuga and it goes round again. With Vico, you get down to his 3 ages: the age of the father, the age of the sons, his sons, and then the age of the people, or theocracy, aristocracy, and democracy, the age of the gods, and then the age of the heroes, and then the age of the people. And then finally you get the 4th stage, the ricorso, which is the disintegration of everything into chaos, and then a new culture comes and starts the cycle all over again with Vico. He's inherited that model. And so, but the one-shot arc that the Hebrews also have with Genesis and down to Apocalypse, it's a one-shot arc, and it originates with the Hebrews and the influence upon them of Persian mythology and eschatology. So they're exposed to a lot more than just the idea of immortality of the soul. There are lots of mythical ideas, and possibly the idea of Satan is a transformation of the god of darkness, Angra, and very likely so. So that covers the first half of this essay, and it's down here on aphorism number 53, where Christ enters the stage, and he says, "So now a better instructor must come and snatch the exhausted primer from the child's grasp." So Christ came. So we'll look at the rest of this essay in the third and final video of this series on Lessing's Education of the Human Race.